My Gavanen Melonin, and well met indeed. I'm Arachir Galadirthan, head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, and welcome to the first in a new series of videos to give more information and life to the factions of Divide and Conquer. Today we will be dealing with Gundabad, but briefly before we do, the aim and goal of this video is to first of all present you all the information we have about each individual faction. It might be geographical, it might be about them as an actual nation. It'll be as informative as I can make it without being 2 hours long. And then the second half of each video will be what have we done in Divide and Conquer to breathe some additional life into those factions. Factions who perhaps didn't really have much backstory or lore, but for purposes of the mod need to have something so they aren't just bland copies of existing nations. As I say, the first part will be Tolkien's setting and the second will be Divide and Conquers. And today is Gundabad. In the far frozen north, beyond the upper vales of the Anduin, stands a great and ancient peak, Mount Gundabad. Despite its imposing figure and deep spiritual connection to the dwarves of Middle-earth, the mountain's history is mostly shrouded and unknown. It began with the awakening of the dwarves over 9,000 years before Divide and Conquer's story starts, before the sun and the moon began their endless dance across the sky. Deep beneath the mountain, in a simple chamber, Aule, father of all dwarves and the eternal craftsman of the Valar, placed his seventh son, Durin the Deathless, to sleep. There, in time, alone, Durin awoke. Yet he did not stay in Gundabad and began his long journey of discovery, always heading to the south. His wanderings brought him to the Miromer, and there, beneath 3 high peaks, he founded the great dwarven mansion of Khazad-dûm. Gundabad was not forgotten by the dwarves, however, and a small delving was begun. Whilst no dwarves were said to take up residence in the northern mountain, Gundabad became the closest thing the gruff sons of Aule had to a shrine or a spiritual centre. For thousands of years the mountain stood quiet, hallowed ground visited by pilgrims and dwarven delegations where major decisions needed to be made. Long through the First Age and deep into the Second, the mountain shrine endured, untouched by the troubles of the wider world, until the shadow finally reached the foothills of Ziegler in the later years of the Second Age. Sauron, Melkor's lieutenant, had fled to Middle-earth after the downfall of Beleriand and the banishment of his master at the end of the First Age. For long years he brooded in Mordor, and there he developed his plans for domination of all the world's creatures. Sauron unleashed his attacks on the world in earnest in the year 1695 of the Second Age. His armies flooded into Eriador to put down the accursed elves who denied his power and hid their rings from him. At that time, peace, prosperity, and friendship existed between the elves and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. When Sauron's armies overran Ostin-Edil, the dwarves unleashed a furious surprise attack on the orcs and evil men to help their long-beleaguered allies. They caught their enemy wholly off guard and were able to gain some ground until Sauron was able to turn the full might of his army back on the dwarves. Alone and surrounded on all fronts, the dwarves retreated behind their great mountain wall, and the doors of Durin, so long held open as a sign of peace, were finally shut and locked. The dwarves' long isolation and segregation from the world had begun. With the armies of the dwarves imprisoned behind their own walls, Sauron sent his orcs to scour the mountains and defile and destroy any trace of elven or dwarven residence. In time, the orcs came upon Gundabad itself, and with no protection and no guards to hold them off, any vestige of dwarven civilization was removed from that place, and this was the first sacking of Gundabad. The mountain, an important and symbolic dwarven site that had been held in peace by the dwarves for over 4,000 years, was lost. Orcs took the mountain utterly, and where the dwarves had erected few dwellings and had tampered little, the orcs turned the place into a hive, and for the next 4,200 years the mountain remained an orc stronghold. The dwarves, however, did not forget this transgression, and they fought the orcs time and time again. Through thousands of untold skirmishes, the two races constantly beat at one another. The dwarves had the fury, the strength, and the might, but the orcs had a bloodlust, a drive for war, and numbers. Neither side gained any real success in the wars for the underground, but they raged nevertheless. That is, until one orc chieftain did the unthinkable and killed a king. The story now takes us forward to the year 2790 of the Third Age, and by this time the Longbeards are a people in ruin. They have long since been cast out of Khazad-dûm, now known as Moria, the Black Pit, and they have recently lost their second home to a fire-breathing vagrant. They turned to wandering, and settled first in the low foothills of Dunland. And there they carved out a meagre existence working with the lowly and quite technologically backwards people of that region. Their king, Thror, was overcome with rage and bitterness as he surveyed his people and realized just how far they had fallen. He set out to find a better life for the dwarves in their ancestral home of Khazad-dûm. He took one companion, Nar, and the two made for the mountains. They climbed over the misty mountains and came down upon the open east gate of Moria, and Nar begged Thror not to go in, but the king was unmoved. Alone, King Thror crossed the threshold of the mountain. Now for many days, Nar hid by the gate, silently waiting and keeping watch, until one day Thror finally emerged. Although in truth, Thror's body emerged, and shortly thereafter so did his head, as it was thrown from the doorway by the chieftain inside. Inscribed upon the forehead of the severed head, in dwarven runes no less, was the name Azog. The orc chieftain then threw a bag of coins out at Nar and told the beggar to flee. Nar brought the news of Thror's murder back to the dwarves, and a great crusade was eventually born. King Thrain, son to Thror, called upon all the dwarves to answer the call to war, and end the hold the orcs had over the dwarven mansions of the Misty Mountains. The war of the dwarves and orcs raged for 6 years, and not a single orc hold in the mountains was spared. The dwarves began their cleansing crusade, and started in the far north at Mount Gundabad. The holy site was utterly purified of the orc filth. From there, the army of the 7 dwarven clans made its way south and cleared every orc hold one by one until they reached Moria itself, and the climactic battle of Azanulbizar began. Azog was slain in the battle, but the dwarves did not take back Moria. The army disbanded, and the dwarves of Durin's folk returned to their wanderings and moved away to settle in the Blue Mountains. Despite the overwhelming success of the dwarves, Mount Gundabad was not held, and shortly after the Battle of Azanulbizar, or Nanduhirian as it was known by the elves, the mountain came back into the hands of the orcs. And there Gundabad remained long into the Third Age, a stronghold of the orcs, until Sauron himself was cast down and the orcs became nothing but bands of leaderless bandits, picked off and silenced by the growing power of men. This is, however, where Divide and Conquer imparts its own tale. Hereafter follows the story as created by me and the modding team of Divide and Conquer. This is not canon in any way from this point forward, and is used purely to give more life and setting to a Total War reading of Middle-earth. Without these expansions to the lore and fan additions, the mod would simply have no foundation. The lands to the north of Gundabad are said to be a frozen wasteland. Little to nothing survives in that harsh place, and it is forgotten from all the histories. Yet deep in the harsh icelands there survives a people, long thought lost to the world. In a different age, they followed the greatest shadow that ever lived, Morgoth, the one true enemy. They gave their lives for his wars, and they lived for his victories. When the War of Wrath destroyed their homeland, they fled, like many others, to Middle-earth. Yet unlike their southern kin and many from orc kind, they did not take Sauron as their new master. They would forever, until their dying breath, serve Morgoth. For all of the Second Age and long into the Third, they endured in the frozen north. Their surround shaped them and moulded them. When they had fled from Angband, They were but simple orcs, no greater or more feared than any other of their kin. But 5,000 years of living in this harsh and unforgiving world had changed them, and now they took up a new mantle: Snow Orcs. They were stronger and hardier than their southern kin. They had a deeper connection to one another, as was needed to simply survive in that frozen place. And they were as to normal orc folk as Númenóreans were to middlemen. For the most part, the Snow Orcs were content to live in the north. Far from the machinations of the powers of Middle-earth, they led simple, peaceful lives. Yet deep within each of them there sat a lust for blood. Blood from those who fought against them so ruthlessly in the First Age. Elves, men, and above all, dwarves. As the years of the Third Age grew old, news reached the Snow Orc kings that the dwarves were mustering an army, the like of which had never been seen before. The Snow Orcs, now brutal and formidable warriors, felt a longing to test their mettle against this mounting crusade, but their king bid them stay their bloodlust. The Snow Orcs sent scouts and a few warriors to their kin in Gundabad to observe the might of the dwarven army, and when it passed through the mountain it became clear that no force of Snow Orcs would hold back the juggernaut. There could be no hope for the weaker southlings, as the dwarves bled their armies time and time again. And yet, the tales of the dwarven savagery stirred a fury in the hearts of the Snow Orcs, and they longed to fight. And their time came. Shortly after the Battle of Azanulbizar, the mountain of Gundabad was abandoned by the dwarves. Seeing that the Southlings would not have the numbers to reclaim it, the Snow Orcs ended their long exile and returned to the world once again. Their people claimed Gundabad for their own, and their warriors came upon any Southling who dared to stand before them. And the goblins of the Orcs of the Misty Mountains were afraid anew. Would this new force now deliver the killing final blow the dwarves could not? But it was not to be so. The Snow Orcs, long accustomed to patience, despite the fury burning in their hearts, sat and waited. They fortified the mountain and watched as the powers of Middle-earth played their military and political games. And finally, in the waning years of the Third Age, the Snow Orcs saw their chance for glory. Sauron's forces would be marching on the Free Peoples, and it seemed either a total victory or crushing defeat awaited him. And into this maelstrom the Snow Orc armies came. The biting wind and deep frost of the Icelands of the north have honed their warriors into an utterly relentless force of strength. Through their sheer power they seek to rival Sauron and all who stand to oppose them. But that goal must wait. For before the world can fall, the sons of Durin must finally pay for all their crimes, and it will be the Snow Orcs of Gundabad who deliver the final, lethal blow. Gundabad in Divide and Conquer are now led by a single king, modelling the hierarchical system that they were used to in the wars of the First Age. In the late Third Age, this king is Mazog, a fine specimen of a Snow Orc. Their faction heir is titled Marauder Chief, leaning on the raiding nature that all orcs have as set down by Tolkien quite frequently in his works. The armies of Gundabad are differentiated from their southern cousins as being defined by strength. They have higher than average attacks and defense stats, but they pay for this with poor armor covering. The frozen Northlands have honed them into brutal and relentless warriors, but the lands being devoid of raw materials has seen the Snow Orc favours fur and warmth over chainmail or plate. However, the Snow Orc love of raiding and their bitter rivalry with the dwarves allows them to scavenge dwarven armour, and many of their units can upgrade to a more dwarven-inspired look. To give weight to the Snow Orcs' disunion from Sauron and their total isolation for thousands of years, they do not start the game allied to anybody. Their victory conditions only have you going up against the dwarves as well, so there's no defined path save as to kill your hated enemy. Lastly, the Snow Orcs have a subjugation system that is similar to the Dunedain Beacon of Hope or the Ardenheim Auxiliary system. Through their power, both physical and of will, the Snow Orcs are able to convince the lesser orcs to fight for them and not for Sauron. This helps the Snow Orcs greatly, as they have no trash tier or early expendable warriors until they have conquered the lands of other orcs. For instance, the hordes of weak Snaga from the Misty Mountains will fight for Gundabad once they capture Goblin Town. Overall, the armies of Gundabad are defined by strength, not commonly seen in other Orc nations, save perhaps for those under Saruman's command. But where the White Wizard favours sorcery and armour to make better warriors, the Snow Orcs have been moulded to be strong by the world itself. And so concludes this lore meets divide and conquer lore overview of Gundabad. I chose Gundabad first because there's not very much information from Tolkien about what we know of Gundabad, and indeed on the divide and conquer side we haven't had to change up too much. So this was a nice test, if you will, and I'd be very eager to hear your thoughts on this series in the comments below, and whether or not you'd like something like this to continue. But until we do speak again, dear friends, Navarne den Peramad Melonin, and farewell.